When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 64. He climbed out from under the dark mental space that only high achievers ever get into. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our courageous and daring guest, Kwasi Adupoku. Kwasi is a small business owner and a former varsity athlete for McMaster University, located in Ontario, Canada. He is also a master's policy student at Toronto Metropolitan University and resides in the neighborhood referred to as Jane and Finch. He currently works as an account coordinator for the province of Ontario on housing and homelessness programs. Kwasi has launched his very own virtual business called the Reach Series in the year 2020, based on his varsity basketball and mental health challenges, and uses this platform to provide workshops, speaking services, and custom apparel promoting personal development. He is passionate about leadership, community engagement, and academics, which is reflected in his 20-plus awards and $70,000 in scholarship funding. Behind all of Kwasi's achievements, however, is a man who has constantly felt that he could do more, that he wasn't enough, and this is the battle he will share with all of us today. Hey, Kwasi. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
What's up? How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Oh, that's so great. Yes, it's my pleasure to have you. I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to have you as a guest on the show today. I am so grateful that you have this willingness to come forward and say, yes, I want to tell my story. You know, Kwasi, for me, I always feel blessed and honored to encounter guests who allow me to tap into their vulnerabilities and draw from their strength and insight and their inspiration and all those stories that are shared with me, that are shared here. You know, it really is inspirational. And so it's really important that together, you and I take a stance to help break barriers of mental stigma.
I definitely think that's important. And I think it's also amazing how you can create these spaces where not only we, the speakers, can kind of tap into some of our untold stories, but you're also giving people listening the courage to reflect on their lives as well. So I just think it's an amazing thing that you're doing.
Thank you. I really believe it's all about the cycle of resourcing, right? We've got on one side someone who has to dare themselves, who has to be brave and courageous to break out of their shell, to share their story, to really be authentic and vulnerable, to speak up and let it all be heard. And my hope has always been that it encourages and inspires and provides like that inspiration, that spark of hope to someone who could be going through something so similar or relate to your story in some way, so that we can encourage those people to come forward. So I think it's always a balance But I do feel it's all about the cycle of resourcing, and it all comes full circle.
For sure. And that's a very beautiful way to look at it.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. So, in the event that you're still wondering, in terms of this podcast, the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, this is a podcast that's all about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether it is directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And what we do know is that no matter what the story is about, there is impact on one's own mental health in some way. And that typically remains tucked away for the person. So, this platform is really meant to serve in a way that breaks those barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So, together, my hopeful mission is for the both of us to encourage people to share and tell what individuals typically have reservation for expressing. Of course, I continue to bring forward a trend, and it's called the mental beauty rethink. Kwasi, as the curious person that I am, please tell me what's the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear the phrase the mental beauty rethink?
When I think mental beauty, it makes me think about when people talk about beauty, they say how it's in the eye of the beholder. So to me, mental beauty, it kind of sounds like our perception of mental health, but how we each choose to perceive it individually. Because it just makes me think what's quote unquote healthy to me may look different to other people, but at the end of the day, it's how we choose to perceive it. That's just the first thing that comes off the brain.
That's really great. It's so lovely when I get to ask this question to people because I always feel like all of the answers are so rich and there's always so much that I learn from my guests. And that's one thing that I always aim for with the message of mental beauty. Just the idea of it being an invitation to be open to see things differently, to see it from a different angle. So I really appreciate that you're able to share your perspective with me. Thank you.
It's no problem at all.
So, Kwasi, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
If I had a newspaper headline, I think I'd title it How I Never Felt Like Enough, even when I was doing too much.
How I never felt enough, even when I did too much. In a sentence or two, could you touch on what that means for you?
To me, it just makes me reflect on how, for many reasons of my life, I've felt like I've had to work twice or even four times as hard. But even if I were to get achievements in many cases, I still feel that I was missing something. And it has contributed to a constant void I felt that I still to this day continue to work on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, thank you for sharing that. That's a really important aspect in your journey. And so, without further ado, I'm just going to get straight in and ask you to tell us what your untold story is all about. Tell us about the who, the what, the when, the where. Let's hear about it.
Well, I think I'd want to touch on one moment in high school that I feel almost parallels a lot of the things I went through.
Okay.
And in terms of who, I'd say it was just a young kid trying to do his best to be successful, who thought he'd find that through basketball and in some ways education. In terms of what, this was around the time I was actually in my fifth year of high school because I took an extra year, but I was someone who was desperate to get recruited for basketball, even though I didn't really play much in my early years of high school. So I
Mm-hmm.
worked extra hard to finally get recruited and finally get looked at. But I found that even though I finally got an offer to McMaster, I didn't have the grades to get there. So I had to get my GPA up by 8 points in one semester and I had to work ridiculously hard. And I
Mm-hmm.
found that even when I did get recruited, I still didn't have, the approval I thought I'd get from my parents that I thought would make me feel whole. And it just made me realize how much weight I put on their approval, but it started to make me think about how even though I spent most of my life building up to that moment of getting their approval and getting that university offer, when it came and I didn't feel what I thought I would, I started to just realize that I really needed to redefine how I view thinking I was enough. And it was something I struggled with throughout my undergrad, but it's something that really hit me when I was going into undergrad myself when high school ended. But it echoes to this day, even as I go up on my master's. I think now I'm slowly starting to find answers in that lifelong question I've been asking myself.
Right. It sounds like you were really motivated to push through a lot of barriers and boundaries. It seems like you had a very clear goal of what you wanted to pursue and you were going at it at all lengths. But it sounds like from what you're saying is that you really were relying on external surroundings, like external validation, like wanting to get your parents' approval. And at what point did you recognize that it was going to take more than that?
I'd say I realized that halfway through my undergrad experience in university, because before that, like many people, I'd kind of have spurts where I'd be really focused on myself and the external noise wouldn't really get to me. But I found that for the most part, when it was the end of the day and I was just alone with my thoughts,
Mhm,
everything everyone else thought of me would still come in. But by the time I got to my third year of university, I know we'll touch on my basketball career a bit, but it got to a point where my self esteem would ride on my performance. So if I wasn't playing good, I wasn't feeling good, and vice versa. But
mhm,
it got to a point where my performance dropped for a prolonged amount of time, and it actually took me to a dark mental space where I wasn't able to eat, I wasn't able to get out of bed on weekends, and my mental and physical health was deteriorating. So even though it's the season, like I started to seek therapy because I just knew I had to make a change. And as I went through that therapy process after my season ended, which was basically the summer of it was 2019, I
mhm.
started to experience a lot of change and a lot of growth, and that's when I started to realize how important it is to really rely on yourself for approval and to continually find ways within yourself to find that recognition. Because if you seek it externally, that stuff's inconsistent, and you'll feel the same thing in terms of your mood.
Right. You know, it's so important that you talk about relying on yourself for encouragement and confidence and believing in yourself and understanding who you are, no matter how someone else sees you. And
Mhm.
it sounds like that was a big transformational process for you. And
Yeah.
so it was relieving for me to hear that you were able to make that connection for yourself. I caught something you said a few moments ago, and you talked about when you were alone with your thoughts, it was pretty intense for you. Can you share when you were alone with your thoughts what that experience was like?
In many of those instances, I found that I'm the kind of person who reflects on everything I say to people. If I have a conversation with someone, there's a high chance that when I'm alone, I'm probably going to replay it. I'm going to ask myself if I was putting on a mask, if I was being genuine. And just my mind kind of works like that sometimes. And I'd find that when I'm alone, I would not only be analyzing every aspect of my life, but I'd also just be thinking about if I'm going to get to where I'm desperately trying to go. Because I've grown up trying to hold myself accountable in so many ways to ensure I can be successful. And I find that when I'm alone, that
Mm-hmm.
voice that's pushed me to succeed can also be the voice that pushes anxiety in some senses, because I'm always just asking myself, what can I do? What can I do? And I find that the conversations can, in some cases, promote growth, but in many cases, in retrospect, I find that they do leave a lingering worry with me that, like I tell you, it's something I'm still continually learning to unpack and live with.
Mm-hmm. 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 Can you talk about that relationship with your self-esteem and your performance in, I guess it was basketball we were talking about?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to speak on that because it's something that I've struggled with since I was a kid. When I was playing soccer in elementary school, my coaches would get on me sometimes because of how much my self-esteem fluctuated. By the time I started playing basketball in high school, it would be the same thing where if I had a bad start to a game, the game was pretty much done for me. I'd just be constantly in my head. Pretty much, I found that as my university career progressed and I actually started to get more playtime on the court, there was even a point in my second year where I was leading OUA, Ontario University Athletics, the provincial league for basketball at the time, in offensive rebounds. So I found that my performance was at a high level and I felt very confident. By the time my next season came and my minutes dropped as new players came, I found that my confidence dropped with it. Not even just as an athlete, as a person. People could often sense my demeanor and my energy drop with how good or how bad a game was for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a good time. It took me to some really dark places. And it was the kind of thing where I realized hard work wasn't the only solution, like I used to think before. And that's when things like therapy and counseling really came and took me out of that dark space, or continue to give me the tools at least to see some light in these spaces.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what was life like when you had encountered the dark spaces? Do you recall any prominent things that you were experiencing at the time that you might be able to speak to right now?
I use this analogy sometimes, and it's for people who've like been to the gym, like if you know like squatting and bench pressing and those
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. In terms of how it felt, I'd say it almost felt like there was a weight I used that was too heavy. And even though I felt how heavy the weight was, even though I felt like it was something I couldn't do, I'd still feel myself trying my hardest and hardest to push it up as I felt like I was sinking. So that's kind of the space I felt I was in. I felt like the time would pass, but it wasn't until the weight brought me to the floor that I could realize that I could just, scoot on out of the rack and just find ways to really prepare myself to handle these kind of things.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great analogy. You are able to then say it was, would still try while I was sinking. How deep is that to experience? You might have felt like you were going through the floor, but you're still trying to push up, right? Like still trying to bring those weights up. That must have been a really very difficult time for you. And it must have been confusing too, because part of you is motivated to keep going. And then there was so much struggle internally. Yeah, in fact, I'm very curious, Kwasi. Clearly, this analogy shows that what you were experiencing on the inside was very different than what you were experiencing on the outside, or what people would see from the outside. Can you speak to that a little bit?
In terms of that mismatch between what I felt internally versus externally,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's something I think a lot of us can relate to, but I know at times we do want to open up to people about how we feel. And I feel like sometimes, even for the most open of people, it's hard to really let people in on what's going on inside. And I found that even when things were very hard for me,
Mm-hmm.
especially when I was in university and there are certain midterms and exams that I have to complete, I'd
Mm-hmm.
find that I'd have to try to keep it together just long enough so that when an exam was done, I could just go home and just let it all out. I feel like you have to try and do your best to keep it together. But I'm starting to realize that now I really try to give myself more room to acknowledge that there is stress in trying to keep things together. And I feel like that gives me the power to keep going.
Mm-hmm. And on the inside, like, did you ever feel a sense of emptiness?
I definitely say emptiness is what I felt. And
Yeah.
I guess to even fast forward to more of my modern day circumstance, I just completed my master's at TMU. I did a master's in public policy and administration. It was a 1 year program.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. That this
Mm-hmm.
year flew by. It was wild. But
Mm-hmm.
even in getting to the program, I feel like we have a logical side to us and emotional side. But
Okay.
from a logical standpoint, I felt like I knew I was doing big things and I knew it was something to be proud of. But emotionally, I just did not feel what I thought I would feel. And I think that's when I started to have a even higher awareness for the burnout I was
Mm-hmm.
facing, because to that moment I've just spent so much of my life just working hard and pushing myself to the limit, and I would just never truly give myself the time to relax or even the time to just validate how hard I was working. It'd always just be someone else has it works, keep pushing. It'd always be you can do more, keep pushing. But
Right.
that was, I definitely say, a big waking point for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Kwasi, because I mean, you talk about this pattern of perfectionism, right? This high achieving, go-getter attitude, do it at all cost. And you talk about this theme of like how you were just not present, right?
Hmm.
This feeling of you knew it was a proud moment, but you weren't able to take time to take it in, to process it, to celebrate the win, but emotionally you had no feelings about it. Like you were so burnt that there was no emotion that you were really feeling from within. I get curious if there was a part of you that ever experienced imposter syndrome. And the reason I ask this is because you also mentioned in your newspaper title how you never felt enough. And so I often find that there's a big relationship between perfectionism and imposter syndrome. And I was curious if you reflect now if imposter syndrome was part of this journey for you.
It's funny you say that because I actually have publications speaking to my experiences with imposter syndrome.
Okay.
Even in my last year of undergrad, I won a very prestigious scholarship at my alma mater, McMaster. It was called the Wilson Leader Scholarship Award. The founder even
Mhm.
recently made a very generous $50 million investment to building a leadership college. Like it's a pretty big program, but
Yeah,
I found that
absolutely.
even oh, thank you so much. I found that even in that announcement and being selected as one of very few students in that,
Mhm.
imposter syndrome is something I constantly spoke to my supervisor, Liz, at the time, who works there. We still talk to this day, but it was very funny because I found that the more I spoke outwardly about imposter syndrome, the
Mhm.
more people started to relate to me
Mhm.
because it was something I kept very internally, and it's something I still continue to unpack at times, but I found that the more I could vocalize that, the more people would resonate with the same doubt they had, no matter how much people accomplished. I think that ultimately helped empower me to want to help people to overcome that imposter syndrome because it's a voice that grows bigger when we don't voice it to others. So I try to be a voice to help others really reflect on how we can often be our own greatest enemies.
Yeah. And so, what was it like for you to speak openly about imposter syndrome? Because that's like you really meeting your internal and external sides. It's like you're allowing them to both emerge in the public view, right? What was that like for you?
I won't lie, at first it was scary because that imposter syndrome voice in me that was saying, if you even mention this to people, everyone's just gonna confirm that you suck. Like it sounds silly to say out loud, but that's usually how it is when we're hard on ourselves. But at first, I had a lot of anxiety in being this open about the things I
Mhm.
went through because
Right.
I just know when it's out there kind of
Mhm.
thing. That's just the way of the internet. But I found that the more I did it, the more comfortable I got doing it.
Mhm.
And I also found the more people would resonate with me, whether it was people I spoke to a lot or people I would see in passing. I was starting to find that I'd have more of those conversations like, hey, I saw this post you made, or I saw this thing of you on the internet, and it really, I never knew you went through that. Like, I've dealt with the same thing. So it's validating to hear you say that. And I definitely find that it gets easier to speak to that over time. I do also know that I make sure that with what I put out there, it's something I've thought about for a while. It's something I've processed because I don't really try to put content out there that I know I'm still uncomfortable sharing because, like I told you, some
Yeah.
of this stuff is, if you're
It's
not ready,
raw.
yeah.
And
Hmm.
it makes complete sense to say, like, I'm aware that I'm still working on these issues, and these are the ones that are still raw, so I'm going to process that a little bit more. But what I'm hearing you say is that once I integrate something that I've experienced and I'm able to make sense of it and I'm able to explore it and have a good understanding of it, and I understand the lessons behind it, the value in it, and I can see it from different angles, I'm ready to share it with people and give that experience to people because then it's a full experience, right?
No, I really agree because I think a lot of the lessons that we take usually come after long amounts of time we spend sitting with them because I just think if we've had certain experiences that we still can't wrap our heads around, I think
Hmm.
we just need more time to process it. I'm not saying there's a lesson in everything, but I do know there are tidbits of knowledge we can take when we reflect on things long enough.
Hmm. Yeah. When you take the time to reflect, right? This is the whole process of slowing down, right? We're human beings who have this tendency to work really fast-paced environments. We have a lot of technology to keep up with, a lot of expectations that sometimes we put on ourselves or we get conditioned by others or just by our surroundings to go at a certain speed. But it's really about slowing the mind down, slowing the brain down, and just saying, hey, if I was to just take a recount of what just happened, if I was to just take a moment to reflect, if I just take a moment to look at what are the things that just happened and make sense of it, I feel like you have more awareness and insight into all the puzzle pieces so that the next time you're putting your foot forward, you're more equipped with more knowledge and it does shape how you take your next steps.
I think that's a very great point because when you speak about the idea of putting the puzzle pieces together, I do think there are a lot of learning opportunities. And I
Mhm.
do think that when you like you said, really take the time to reflect on them, you're just preparing yourself to take greater steps forward the next time. So I think that's a very great point.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's another part that I'm really curious about. So we've been talking a little bit about basketball. It's been coming and going from our conversation, right? And I'm curious about the overall impact basketball has had on you.
For the scope of my life, I definitely say that basketball to me has represented possibilities because when I was in grade seven, I suffered a very traumatic knee injury that actually had me debilitated for around 4 months. I had a cast. I couldn't really walk properly, and I had a very noticeable limp.
Mhm.
My surgeon told me that if I got the surgery to fix my knee a day later, I probably wouldn't have been able to walk properly for the rest of my life.
Whoa.
So I felt like my life was over in many senses
Hmm.
because at the time I really tied my self-esteem to my performance, as I mentioned to you, because
Hmm.
I feel like now you're starting to see a lot of the cycles in
Yeah.
my life. But
All the parallels. Yeah.
yeah, but I luckily have two older brothers who are very into basketball who convinced me to kind of get into it because I did track and soccer growing up. Never made the team in middle school for basketball, always get cut. But to me I thought, let me just put my all in this, and I don't know where I'll end up, but if I work really hard, maybe I'll be good enough so that I could be a player who can make people feel better. Because I was someone who people would constantly look down on, especially in the basketball world when I first started. So I just
Hmm.
wanted to be someone who was good enough to be that person who was in a position to have that kind of authority with their skill, but I'd want to lift people up instead of pushing them down. So I worked very hard. It was definitely very rough for the early part of high school, but
Hmm.
over time, I joined the AAU team called Hoops Canada, and they really pushed me to grow. I'd take 2 hour bus rides to get there from Brampton, to get there from Toronto to Brampton, like every weekend. Like I was just really locked in. In high school, I'd spend the summers just working out 3 times a day, just really trying to get recruited. Wouldn't even really hang out with friends. And I found that when I got that recruitment offer that I told you about, even as my career at McMaster progressed and I faced adversity and obstacle after obstacle, and I graduated in the record books for the school after starting off as a walk on, I just
Hmm.
realized that basketball was something that took me to places I could never even have thought of because I didn't really think of university much growing up. The only thing I
Hmm.
really thought of was just getting good enough grades so I could play basketball or so I could play sports. And I found that as I got more into basketball, I continually started to see the value in education. And it's what motivated and inspired me to do my master's, even create my business. So to me, I feel like basketball is at the root of a lot of what I do, even if everything I do necessarily isn't basketball. It's in all my actions in some way, shape, or form, and the lessons I've taken from it.
Yeah. Really sounds like it has really had that impact that might have been that missing puzzle piece for you.
Yeah, I'd say it definitely filled a lot of gaps in my life, and
Hmm.
it continually gives me tools to tackle whatever comes my way, I think.
That's amazing that you have something like that as your superpower that just kind of helps to ignite anytime that you need that reboot or refresh, you know? That's great.
Thank you.
Hmm. So, Kwasi, when people come to see me for therapy, individuals are typically in one of three places. Some people are getting started, they don't really know what they need to start focusing on, but they just know that they've got to start therapy. Some people are in the middle where they're navigating a number of things or they're in the midst of a situation and they need specific support. And some people are looking back. Some people are looking back because they need closure or they're looking to develop some skills or they're looking to, when I say develop skills, like reflecting on maybe some missing puzzle pieces of their own or, just wanting to embark in a new chapter in their life. So they are looking to close up some gaps in unfinished business. So, for yourself, what part of the journey would you say that you're in terms of the story that you've shared today? Would you say that you are getting started in the middle or looking back?
I'd say I'm somewhere in between, in the middle and looking back, because I feel like I've gotten to a point where I've realized that the self work never really ends. But at the same time, since I started, seeking things like therapy and that from 2019, I've constantly had to look back to reflect on why I am the way I am now. So I'd say that I constantly switch between the two. And I do realize though that the more I am in the middle and the more I look back, the more I realize that there's other areas I have to get started in terms of
Mm.
really seeing how I can grow. So I'd say it's a slightly disorganized mess of going between the three, but largely in the middle of all of it, I think.
I mean, it's a really great way of putting it, though, for yourself and for your journey, because sometimes that's what happens, right? As you dive in and start delayering, it's what your subconscious mind is ready for. It's what's bubbled from the unconscious. That's what you're working with. That's what you're unraveling. And the more you unravel, you get more and more connected to things that have been pushed down further, but they start to surface. So I think that's what you're trying to explain. I didn't think it was chaotic at all. I think that you articulated your journey very well. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much. And you even just have a very validating presence in how you speak. I see why you get all the big therapist books. So thank you for this therapeutic space as well.
Oh, that's so awesome. Thank you for that. And Kwasi, what would you say you're grateful for with encountering this journey of your untold story, right? This untold story of really climbing out from under those dark mental spaces, being the high achiever that you are. What are you grateful for?
I'd say the largest thing I'm grateful for is just the perspective that it's given me.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've taken the time now to speak about my journey and the darkness I've continually tried to climb out of, but the more I start to dive into my story, the more I start to even speak with other people, I'm really starting to see that we all have some element of darkness in our own lives that we continue to climb out of. And I think that perspective has helped me move with a lot of empathy, a lot more grace and patience towards people. And I feel like at the end of the day, I'm very grateful for that because I think we're all deserving of basic elements of kindness. And I know that if I gave into my darkness too much, I could have become a very bitter person. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
grateful that it's inspired me to constantly think about how I could help other people manage their pain a little bit more.
Right. Yeah. Sounds like your gratitude bucket is definitely, you have awareness of the things that have helped shape you and you're definitely expressing a lot of grace and gratitude. So that's awesome. Kwasi, we have talked about your untold story and how you're affected and a lot of the different elements and different parts of your story that have emerged and themes that have come up along the way and what you've had awareness of. And you have spoken about how it's affected you in so many ways. But I'd like us to come back to how your story has specifically affected your mental health. So I know you spoke a little bit about it, where you introduced the concepts of some things of how you were affected. But could you say a little bit more about it? Like, can you talk about emotions that you experienced or certain thoughts that you encountered and maybe how that manifested for you?
I would say that it manifested in all kinds of ways when I reflect on how the past couple of my years have been.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know that anxiety was a very big one.
Yeah.
There'd just be this constant element of uncertainty. And I know you might have heard of this or even people listening, but I know that sometimes when you feel different emotions, you feel them in different parts of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I still vividly can close my eyes and remember that tightness on not the right side, but the left side of your chest
Mm-hmm.
and the knots that drop in your stomach. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I could recall that for a very large length of my life. The numbness that comes from feeling overworked, feeling unsure of where you're even going when you just get so tired of being anxious about it all.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like those two are the main things that I've really felt. But I
Yeah.
do also know that the shortness of breath, it's hard to describe, but it wouldn't be so much as hyperventilating or those kind of things, but
Mm-hmm.
just slightly feeling like I was uneasy. Like I couldn't really describe it then, but looking back, I just have so many moments where it was almost like my body was telling me that like things were not okay, but I would try to act like everything was all right.
Right. And did it feel like just shallow breathing? Like you weren't able to take a full breath?
Yeah, it was kind of surprising because it'd be the kind of thing where I think I'm breathing regularly, but I just noticed that I wasn't doing a full inhale. Like
Right.
something about it just didn't feel right. And in those situations, I'd have to exaggerate my breathing to kind of recenter myself. But I noticed
Mhm.
that come up a lot.
Right. So those are some of the physical manifestations of how it came up and really noticing it rooted in anxiety. What are some of the emotions that you experienced at the time? Like, was there any sadness or confusion or worry or shame or any emotions that you can recall experiencing back then?
I definitely say sadness was a very prevalent one.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who know the term, I'd say there was also melancholy, where it
Mm-hmm.
was almost like an acceptance of sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And looking back, one of my high school coaches, it's funny, they gave me the nickname Eeyore at times, if you know Winnie the Pooh,
Mm-hmm.
because to a lot of people, they'd kind of see me smiling and they would think like everything's all good, but there'd always be few people who could just really see kind of the bricks I'd carry in my backpack, which is something one of my counselors told me in the past, which is a great visual. But I
Mm-hmm.
definitely say that sadness, that melancholy, in some cases despair, where I just feel like even if things are going great, like what's gonna happen next? You have this moment, but what's coming in the future? You know, just never fully being in the moment, but never even fully being confident in what's to come. I say
Mm-hmm.
those were definitely the main things that play for me that I can still remember to this day.
Yeah. And what was it like to have those emotions be experienced? How did you cope with it, or how did it affect you? What did it make your days look like?
I found that initially when I'd have those kind of thoughts, I'd try and reject them. I'd try
Mm-hmm.
and just tell myself to be positive and to be optimistic and everything's going to work out. And while I think that can help in some cases, I found that in the long run of things, it actually kind of prolonged the emotions and feelings that I needed to process. As I got older, I started to deal with these emotions by just giving myself the room to acknowledge them. Like if
Mm-hmm.
something happened that brought about shame, for example, instead of just trying to reject it, I'd ask myself, why am I feeling this way? I'm feeling this way for a reason. Let's think about it. Like I started getting in the habit more of just having positive conversations with myself, because we do often talk about how we should be our own best friends in some cases.
Yeah.
And I started really thinking, would I talk to my best friend like this? And when I ask myself that question, it's constantly equipped
Mm-hmm.
me to just talk to myself with more kindness when I do feel those kind of emotions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really great that you're able to share all of these things that you've been able to reflect on over the years. That's really crucial. I would really like to know if you can share what is your key message to the listeners of our show? What do you want them to know?
If I could tell you to take one thing from my experiences, because I know you have plenty in your life, I would honestly just tell you to give yourself the room to feel what you need to feel. Because I know for me, I was so caught up in being successful that I pushed myself to some very extreme levels of hard work. And though it did pay off in some senses, there is still some negative effects that I continue to unpack. There was a lot of shame and invalidation in trying to push myself. And I really just wish that I was kinder to myself in that process. So I'd really tell you that no matter where you're trying to go, or no matter what you encounter in life, to just give yourself the room to validate all the emotions you feel, because you're feeling them for a reason. And the more you give yourself the space to acknowledge them, the more you're going to get the clarity you need to move forward with some confidence.
Those are some really wise words, and I'm so happy to hear that these are the words that you're choosing to ensure that the listeners get to hear. It is so important, everything you said. It's so common for people to feel shame and invalidation, Kwasi. And I think that really letting people know, hey, give yourself room to feel what you need to feel is so important, and to unpack your needs and let yourself unpack them and validate everything that comes up and giving yourself space to acknowledge those things. I think these are really important messages, and it really resonates for me too. So I'm so glad that you're sharing this with the audience. That's excellent. Is there any other message that you feel you need to put out there?
The only other one I'd say is to just constantly check how you talk to yourself, because the voice you share with yourself can oftentimes be the sneaky one that really undermines you. So I just say start trying to catch yourself when you feel like you're in those patterns of really just being your own worst enemy. That's just the
Hmm.
only other thing that comes to mind.
Great. Yeah. Got to pay attention to that sneaky voice, right? Hmm.
Hmm.
All right. So I'm really curious about what is that game changer inspiration that's close to you that would reflect your untold story? is there like an inspirational quote or book or something that really speaks to you in terms of something that really helped you shift in your journey?
I'd say it boils down to two things because you
Mhm.
said books, so one thing came to mind. One book was called Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. I have like a library in my room, like a tiny one,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
it's basically a book that talks about in order to be productive, you have to learn how to slow down, actually.
Mhm.
And for someone like me that was anxious, I found that book very helpful. And in terms of a quote that's really helped me the past couple of years, and I heard it from my therapist 3 years ago.
Mhm.
It's basically, if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. And for someone who's constantly asked themselves if they were doing enough, if they are enough, that quote's honestly a reminder to think about how I can really just learn to, quote, complete myself before I achieve things, because that feeling of enough isn't going to be at the destination. That feeling of enough is something that you carry with you. So that
Mhm.
quote's a reminder to just really check myself in the present versus
Yeah,
thinking the future is going to solve all my problems.
I really like it. Can you say the quote one more time?
If you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it.
Mm, so powerful. That is amazing. So, Kwasi, what is a cause or an organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you'd like to give a shout out to?
I'd say there's a couple growing up. I don't recognize the real. I don't think they still exist anymore, but it was a Jane and Finch based group that gave me the opportunity to play basketball. And those Canadian Basketball Academy, Hoops Canada, which is the first and only AAU team I played for, the Wilson Leader Scholarship Award, which has been a great help. Then there's also Gen Chosen, which it's a GTA based group that also gave me access to therapy. And there's honestly just so many groups I could give credit and shout outs to.
Hmm.
But I think there's many people like me in that boat who can just give so much of their success and so much of their circumstance to nonprofit organizations that have helped people from equity deserving communities like myself just have a chance at this thing called life. But if we
Hmm.
did that, honestly, I feel like I might need another hour. So I can shout them out. And if anyone feels like I didn't shout them out, like holla at me and I will shout you out with my chest on LinkedIn. I don't know. But a lot of places have really helped me get where I am today.
All right. So, Kwasi, how can people connect with you if they would like to? How are you available?
Yeah, if you'd like to chat or look more into my public speaking and workshop inquiries or learn more about my business, I'd say that you could feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Kwasi Erupoku. I also have an Instagram for the Reach series specifically, and I do have a website as well for you to look through. So I definitely say those three things if you want to holla.
Amazing. And we've grabbed those from you, so they will be on your show notes page. So, Kwasi, guess what?
What's up?
You've just dared yourself to share. Congrats.
Thank you so much.
How was that experience for you?
It kind of flew by. It felt therapeutic in a sense. Feel good. I feel good.
That's awesome. Kwasi, I would just like to take a moment to show my gratitude in terms of the story that you've shared here today. It's not easy to be on that side of things, being a known high achiever, and then talking about how this has been something that you've been working hard to break free and away from, and fully speaking your truth and not holding back and sharing the dark spaces you have freed yourself from and continue to work to free yourself from, and all the efforts to pay it forward has definitely been noticed. And I'm truly grateful to have been able to hear and witness your story today. So thank you for the deep conversation and for all the daring and sharing.
I just want to say thank you for having me, and to the people who have gotten this far. I hope that with whatever you're dealing with in life, you'll just continue to find a way to make it through, because I know that's what we're all trying to do at the end of the day. So I wish you the best.
Absolutely, 100%. And once again, Kwasi, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it.
To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.